Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the IPS-Nathan lecture series by Mr. Tan Chong Meng, our 14th S.R. Nathan Fellow for the Study of Singapore. Today, Mr. Tan will be delivering his first lecture titled Global Trade, Attempting Escape Velocity. Following his lecture, Mr. Tan will take questions from the audience in a Q&A session. The Q&A session will be chaired by Mr. Patrick Lee, Cluster CEO, Singapore and ASEAN Markets of Standard Chartered Bank. Before we begin, please allow me to go over some housekeeping rules for the event. Thank you for joining us at the auditorium today. Please be reminded to switch your mobile phones to silent mode. The lecture is being streamed live on Facebook. It will also be recorded and uploaded onto our IPS website and our social media platforms later. Please submit your comments and questions at any time during the lecture through the Facebook comments. For our audience members here at the auditorium today, please step out to the mic during the Q&A session to ask your questions. We will try our best to answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A. We would also like to hear your views on the event. There will be a link in the feed at the end of the lecture, which you can click on to submit your feedback. Director of IPS, Janadas Devon, will now deliver his opening remarks. Director, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, welcome to the 14th IPS-Nathan lecture series. Our 14th S.R. Nathan Fellow is, of course, Mr. Tan Chong Meng, former Group CEO of PSA International. He is not our first S.R. Nathan Fellow from the commercial or corporate sector. I know many of you said that. We had Mr. Ho Kwang Ping as our first S.R. Nathan Fellow. But Kwang Ping made no little reference to his business experience. He spoke about a great many things, but nothing related to business or the corporate sector. In the case of Mr. Tan, we asked him to give the series of Nathan lectures precisely because of his corporate background in a crucial sector of the economy. Indeed, in our mind, he complements the previous S.R. Nathan Fellow, Professor Joseph Liao. Just as we asked Professor Liao to speak of how Singapore might position itself in an increasingly uncertain, fragile and uncertain geopolitical landscape, we asked Mr. Tan to speak of how Singapore might position itself in an increasingly uncertain, fractious and uncertain geo-economic landscape. He is uniquely qualified to speak on this subject. Apart from his earlier corporate experience, he spent the last 13 years helming PSA, the Port of Singapore Authority. Trade from the beginning was Singapore's sine qua non. Singapore would not exist if it weren't for trade. It is not possible to imagine a Singapore that is not open to the world. No sector of our economy is likely to be more affected by geopolitical and geo-economic shifts than trade. PSA, of course, now exceeds Singapore. Its network now encompasses, I read, 160 locations in 42 countries, including 66 deep-sea rail and inland terminals, as well as affiliated businesses in supply chain management, logistics, marine, and digital services. The PSA group handles 1 in 10 global container movements annually, which is quite a remarkable figure. In other words, 10%, serving all major international shipping lines and key stakeholders in the global supply chain. It is without doubt the most open, the most global, the most connected, the most networked Singapore-based entity. I should add that outside PSA Group, Mr. Tan drove the setup of emergency health infrastructure during the COVID-19 pandemic. For his crucial contributions on many fronts to Singapore's pandemic response, he was awarded the Meritorious Service Medal or Pingat Jasa Gemilang by the President of Singapore last year. The citation read in part, he revamped PSA's cargo operations so that supply chains remained open. He also led the setup of several emergency health facilities at the beginning of the pandemic, including the community care facility at Changi Expo and the floating accommodation vessels at Tanjong Pagar Terminal. and he led PSA to facilitate the safe inflow of migrant workers for critical sectors. COVID-19 just happened recently, but already our memories of that crisis of a generation seems to be fading. Lest we forget, I should emphasize, Mr. Tan was among the group of key people who helped save the sum of things for Singapore and Singaporeans, not to mention hundreds of thousands of migrant workers during the pandemic. Mr. Tan's lecture series is titled Exploring Global Trade and Singapore's Place as a World Connector. In this first lecture today, he will delve into the drivers that shaped global trade in the past and how Singapore's position as a key hub port has intersected with global trade developments. He told me just now that quite a lot of it will be history, but I think it's interesting. In his second lecture, on 12th April, he will examine how the shipping industry has been impacted by globalization and geopolitical shifts, providing an insider's perspective of the rapid changes in the world of shipping and also how Singapore has maintained its position as the world's top maritime center. Finally, in his third lecture on 7th May, he will delve deeper into how recent developments are affecting global trade dynamics and examine strategies to future-proof our supply chains. I would like to thank Mr. Patrick Lee, Cluster CEO of Standard Chartered Bank, for moderating today's Q&A. His insights and wide regional experience will undoubtedly enhance the quality of the discussion. The S.R. Nathan Fellowship for the Study of Singapore, that's the full cumbersome title, was established in 2014 to pay tribute to our sixth and longest serving president, S.R. Nathan. It is held on campus. The IPS-Nathan Lectures seeks to advance public understanding and stimulate discussion on national issues and to engage the minds of Singaporeans. Finally, like many other Singaporeans of the first order, Mr. Chong Meng was born in Malaysia, or rather Malaya as it was known when he was born. He shares this distinction with none other than Mr. Nathan himself, not to mention other luminaries like Dr. Goh, Keng Swee, Dr. Toh Chin Chai, Mr. Ong Pang Boon, and many others. For some reason, the best Singaporeans often tended to be Malayan. I believe I echo the sentiments of all present here when I convey our eager anticipation for the insights this Malayan become Singaporean will impart in this lecture series. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Director. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Tan to begin his first lecture titled Global Trade Attempting Escape Velocity. Mr. Tan, please.
Thank you. Well, a very good evening to all, both in the room and online. Thank you for your interest and your presence and participation here. And thank you in particular to our director, Mr. Janadas Devan. That was an amazing introduction, including the last bit. I should say, Janadas, that even though I was born in Malaysia, raised in Johor Bahru, my early years, the weekends were all spent in Singapore at the Singapore National Library. There was no such library in Johor Bahru, so the National Library was part of my education. So Singapore already played a role in my education from a very early age. Now, also thank you in particular for taking interest in the IPS lectures in some more business-oriented discussion. And I think it's indeed quite important and complementary to all the other things that we see happening around us. So the title of my series of lectures is Exploring Global Trade and Singapore as Singapore's Place as a World Connector. As a quick introduction to the series, supply chain management has gained increased prominence in light of disruption caused by forces such as COVID-19, the ongoing unpredictable US-China tensions, and more recently, the Red Sea crisis, leading to conjectures or speculative concerns that this will spur the rise in trade dampeners like resilience countermeasures, deglobalisation, and market bifurcation. Now, add to that potent mix the climate change conundrum and the urgent need to address supply chain decarbonization. And it will be almost a foregone conclusion that there must be fundamental changes to global trade. But changes in global trade is not new. In fact, what I intend to do today is to just walk you through a little bit of history on how it's evolved, the different drivers to date, how Singapore has risen, established itself, and that gives us perhaps some insights and perhaps some wisdom to see how to address the issues of today going forward. I have elected to use the metaphor escape velocity to invoke certain impressions. Now, since the dawn of the space age, thousands of rockets have been launched, with most of them settling into an orbit around Earth, with only a handful going beyond the Earth's gravitational pull to achieve a moon landing or to further flung galactic missions. As an engineer, what I find impressive is that these latter endeavors, i.e. the ones that manage to escape gravitational pull, have to achieve a huge acceleration in order to transcend escape velocity. And there are many rocket launches, but few fulfill those preconditions. So when I look at the GDP growth of key countries in the world and how trade has empowered their growth, it suddenly looks like everyone is achieving to capture its share of global trade and attempt to achieve escape velocity with multi-stage boosters of the international type or local measures, and hence the simile. Now, global trade itself has undergone significant transformation within the last century. So I start with something that we are a lot more familiar with. The dynamics or the encounters that we have with a simple supermarket. Do you know that the first supermarket is thought to only come into existence in the early 1900s? Before the invention of the supermarket, every shop was a specialty food shop of different types. This picture of a 1900s grocery store in America shows a row of shelves lined with a variety of dry packaged goods, mostly canned. Notably absent from the shelves are fresh produce, meats, dairy products, and baked foods, which are not commonly found in the grocery shops of that time. Indeed, shoppers frequented separate specialty stores, such as bakeries and butcher stores, to fulfill their weekly food needs. Therefore, a grocery store was really a store that specialized in packaged food. You would hand your list to the clerk, and he would put the goods together and hand them over to you. Moving forward a few years to what seems like, in hindsight, the first supermarket, we encountered the development and opening of the first modern supermarket of its kind in America, and it was called the Piggly Wiggly. This is where we first see the familiar self-service model, where consumers choose their own products and paid at the cashier. It was a one-stop shop, finally, with fresh and refrigerated produce being placed in the store, probably from local farms. Then, zip through a number of years to the early part of this century, the simple Piggly Wiggly model has undergone a huge transformation into something we are very familiar with today. From the variety of products that are on the shelves to the distances that they travel in order to get to you, these two factors, variety and distances, have exploded, thanks to modern global trade. And then, of course, there's the other way of shopping. In today's digital age, supermarkets are essentially at your fingertips. With the seamless integration of globalization and trade, customers can get their groceries on demand within an hour with the introduction of online supermarkets. When you think about this, just in one century, all these changes are quite phenomenal. And what we then experience as we go around about our daily lives is to not be very aware of all the evolutions of trade and the things that go on in the background in supply chain, in cross-border trade enablements to actually make this happen. So I want to go backwards to see how trade actually started and how it evolved to present day. But just bear in mind that all this that we are exploring or rediscovering in history actually affects your experience today. Now, to me, there are a number of empirical drivers of both trade and its twin, globalization. While they often seem to go hand in hand, my view is when it all started, when it began, trade did precede globalization. I will not go back in time to the moment when the simple wheel was invented, but from those primitive beginnings, we have witnessed successive revolutions in transport. And with each turn of the wheel, pun intended, a leap in speed, distance, and capacity. Combining animals and wheels, distances were extended, and there is perhaps no more familiar name in early trade history than Marco Polo, a Venetian whose travels to the east in the 13th century along the Silk Road are legendary. His exploits are inspirational, and although by today's standards, any trade that he might have conducted is actually quite insignificant, the expeditions demonstrated how transportation was a key driver that opened up the earliest trade routes and frontiers. Of course, there was also exchange of knowledge on the side. A more dramatic turning point took place a few centuries later, roughly during the 15th to 17th century, heralded often as the Age of Discovery and what some call the Age of Exploration, as you see in this picture, and yet others call the Age of Sail. It began with the infamous Admiral Cheng He and his 7 expeditions conducted during the Ming Dynasty between China and Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, and East Africa during the early years of the 15th century. Now, in his own records, Admiral Cheng He would write in rather poetic prose, like, "We have traversed more than 100,000 li of immense water spaces and have beheld in the ocean huge waves or like mountains rising to the sky, etc., etc., etc." But there was a clear mercantile purpose to his trips. The history that he gave us and the ports that he visited, in many cases, are still very relevant today. Now, later in the century came a succession of European expeditions. Enabled by more robust sailing ships, voyages were lengthened. Inter-regional trips, even circumnavigation, was shown to be possible by trailblazing conquests, by the celebrated explorers, names will be familiar to us, at least maybe in primary school or lower secondary, you remember these names: Vasco da Gama, Christopher Columbus, Ferdinand Magellan, and Sir Francis Drake. Now, this could truly be called the global trade pathfinders, because hot on their heels, in the early 1600s, came the formation of the Dutch and the British East India Companies, which were both established then as trading houses and were among the earliest joint stock companies globally. So trade enabled commerce to be grown as international enterprises. These trading companies allowed for the much more efficient acquisition and transport and distribution of goods, which included things, consumables like sugarcane, cotton, tea, gold, diamonds, and I understand some records say even opium. Now, these developments affirm the importance of the maritime industry to global trade connectivity. Nothing was digital, there were no other drivers, it was just the ability to interconnect between countries, nations, and economies. At this time, when the first global trading networks were established, in this pre-industrialization era, trade was probably more of an exchange of goods. The motivation of exploiting comparative advantage in international trade, which is a concept introduced later by the British economist David Ricardo in the early 19th century, was probably still quite nascent. Then we move on to globalization. The advent of industrialization, I believe, was the next major turning point. And that would figuratively be the second stage booster in our metaphoric rocket. As the mobility of people and goods enhanced progressively, so too did technology, enabling better transport, faster communications, and more efficient manufacturing of goods. These factors would turn out to be the ones that enabled and drove the formation of global supply chain, much like the ones we are familiar with today, even though it was similar during those early days, and in turn accelerated global trade. It was during the period after the first industrial revolution that manufacturing became mechanized and scaled, and the world started to become a manufacturing network with distributed and multi-layered factories along global supply chains. The transformative shift in the global trade landscape can also be associated with, and to a large extent be attributed to, the phenomenon of globalization. Now, this phenomenon has been studied by many thinkers, and I would like to borrow the precepts from two such persons. The first is Thomas Friedman. He introduced his 10 flatteners. He argued that the multifaceted process of globalization encompasses far-reaching effects on countries, economic systems, including companies, and individuals. And it's driven first by countries globalizing for resources, so the leadership is by the country. Thereafter, by companies globalizing for customers and labor and resources, and then by individuals seeking to innovate anywhere and connect to anyone. So he was trying to paint the way in which globalization takes place with country leadership, company-based expansion, and societal-based change. The world is flat, Friedman says, not physically, but metaphorically. Among his 10 flatteners, as shown and illustrated here, are factors like the fall of the Berlin Wall, the rise of the internet, and the availability or exchange of information. Now, how do these factors gel together? Now, take the area of outsourcing. With outsourcing, offshoring, supply chaining, flatteners in this category tends to level the playing field, making it possible for individuals and businesses to compete and to collaborate at a global scale. Then turning to technology is one of the areas of focus within his flatteners. A notable factor is workflow software. Workflow software is Friedman's catch-all for the technologies that allow work to flow in a managed or coordinated fashion. We take this for granted nowadays, but indeed, if we look carefully, there are many enablers like such that actually allows us to deal with former complexities in a much more simplified and streamlined manner today. The emergence of such software was deemed to be the genesis moment of the flat world, creating a global platform for collaboration. In short, Friedman's thesis is that globalization is a result of flatteners, to a large extent technology-enabled, leveling the playing field and encouraging collaboration, competition, and the creation of global exchanges and marketplace dynamics. The next person is Klaus Schwab, who, on the other hand, offers a different take to globalization, emphasizing its link to an impact on trade. Take a closer look at this indicator called trade openness, which measures the sum of exports and imports as a % of GDP. And you see that there was a period of reset, if you like, after the Second World War, and a rapid rise to our present day. A little bit of saturation syndrome more recently, but it has risen indeed substantially since the last war. We can indeed perceive the different phases highlighted by Schwab, especially in the aftermath of the World War II, post-Bretton Woods, making a distinct era referred to as globalization 2.0. This era of globalization was tied to the tail end of the earlier industrial revolutions, where improved production methods encouraged mass production, consumption, and transportation. And what was different was after the war, the world was reconstructing and rebuilding, and the power of this industrial revolution started to take hold. As economy progressed, we moved into globalization 3.0, known as new globalization, characterized by the creation of new global value chains and a globalization of industries. In a speech during the Belt and Road Forum in 2019, Schwab highlighted that the open multilateral world drove the spread of ideas and reshaped supply chains through shifting centers of production. Today, we are in the era of globalization 4.0. In the first three eras, we saw globalization affecting those within the manufacturing industry, and in contrast, Schwab opined that globalization 4.0 will see its impact on those who work in the service sectors as well. So, two different perspectives offering us basically slightly different primary lenses from which to understand how the world has embraced globalization and made use of technology and created trade. You have Friedman, who discussed how technology has facilitated seamless work across borders, and Schwab, who commented how globalization created new value chains. I think both factors actually coexist and are in fact intricately related. So no matter which of these two thoughts speaks to you, they provide us with a framework with which to understand how the forces of globalization have reshaped business, daily life, and the global trade landscape of the 21st century. Now, let us move on to examine more specifically how all these dynamics from the influence of transport, industrial revolution, and technology, and the creation of global trade has affected or been assimilated by countries to create economic growth for itself. The chart shows the trajectory of GDP of selected key countries and regions. We see the effect of Europe's early emphasis on maritime transportation and trade partnerships. So you see the UK was an early starter, and that European colonies fundamentally changed their economic frameworks with their countries and the rest of the world with the control of long-distance trade. So this region was indeed a first mover, gradually gathered momentum in line with the evolution and strengthening of industrial growth drivers, became steeper in terms of its economic growth, but on the whole, took a much longer period. Following the European trajectory, the narrative was dominated by the United States, slightly later, but at a quicker pace. And the way this chart is plotted is that it tries to estimate the start of their economic growth, put it at year zero, and then mapped out from there its timeline to achieve a very significantly different and higher economic condition relative to where it started. So we saw the European states and US, and then we see subsequently the shift towards emerging markets, especially in the East. It was during this period that Singapore gained fame as one of the Asian tigers. Now, what is clearly notable is that the later starters charted faster climbs as their quest for escape velocity was better fueled. For those of you who want to learn more about the historical response of the region to the arrival of modern civilization after colonization, I invite you to revisit the second lecture of the 12th IPS-Nathan lecture series by Professor Wang Gengwu, titled Opening to Global Maritime, delivered early last year. Now, moving on from macroeconomics, let's drill down into the technological revolutions that are relevant to globalization and trade. And we talked about transport, now let's get deeper. What we have witnessed is an amazing acceleration in the mobility of people, of goods, of information, and alongside all that, the evolution of global financial systems. And this has taken place over a number of decades, riding on the tailwind of a relatively stable world order. I believe the changes in these 4 areas, people, goods, information, and global finance, taken together, are the most prominent in impacting the pace and the promise of globalization and global trade. I call this the 4 primary mobilities. They're a bit like the basic ingredients that are found in every kitchen of every cuisine. The way they are blended at any single time creates a natural economic and societal outcome that is highly relatable to the concoction of the ingredients. So when you think about a particular country and you see how people move, how financial systems are established, their ability to connect their goods with the rest of the world and information as well, you would see the basic condition for prosperity, manufacturing or otherwise, within a country. So that's the dish you get. So among these various items, let's start with air travel, something we are all familiar with. The 1960s witnessed a start of the upsurge in air travel with the dawning of the jet age. The Boeing 737, the short haul and often also medium haul workhorse of air travel, was actually launched in 1967, not very long after our own independence, and it's still relevant today. Travel then, in those days, as you see in the picture, was more, the cabins were more basic, but travel was actually a luxury, predominantly business related. So despite the basic cabins, the glamour was real, but average travel distances were short, number of people who were exposed to international travel were fewer. Today, a totally different story. Air travel has grown astronomically. The passenger experience has improved tremendously, and leisure travel is predominant. A large proportion of global population has experienced it now, about 1 in 5. With this comes heightened global awareness for individuals, and also the ability for businesses to resource and to manage ever larger global enterprises, stretching into newer markets. So this is truly a flattener in Friedman speak. Let me just go on very quickly to a couple of other factors which I think is even more important. The world shrank as communication technologies improved. Now, starting a little bit again in the past, you'll find me going somewhat back and forth. And I know I'm speaking to a very mixed audience. I'm trying to bring history into our present day before we deal with more of the business-oriented stuff of the future. So, starting from ancient past, information was exchanged through physical travel and human interactions. Knowledge, innovation was carried likewise across continents. The speed at which information was transferred was dependent on travel modes, which could take months and even years. Within the 17th century, postal networks were established, and that facilitated long distance communication through letters and parcels. Delivery times based on distance and infrastructure, delivery times varied based on distance and infrastructure, but this was definitely faster than earlier methods. For example, the news of the independence of the United States of America took only 1 month to reach London. In 1957, the first communication satellite, Sputnik 1, was launched during the space race. Among its motivations was geopolitics, to show its country's technological superiority. But it had long-lasting effects. 2 American physicists realized that by monitoring the Sputnik 1's radio transmitters, they could pinpoint where the satellite was along its orbit. They then investigated the reverse problem, that is, pinpointing the user's location given the satellites. And this gave way to a network of satellites, and with multiple positioning, eventually with 24 communication satellites, you have the global positioning system. Soon after, mobile phones became ubiquitous. Information could be transmitted over long distances instantaneously, enabling real-time voice communication wherever you are. And the birth of the World Wide Web in 1989 was also another of Friedman's flatteners. With the rise of the internet and the development of digital technologies, a new paradigm of information transfer ensued. And very quickly, the rise of social media networks in early 2000s. Communications was no longer limited to one-on-one, but by design, one-to-many. Information can now reach millions within seconds, enabling the formation of e-communities. And today, data can be transferred anywhere at light of speed, with researchers being able to reach data transfer speeds of more than 1 petabit per second. Now, 1 petabit corresponds to 1 million gigabits. Over time, this transformation in communication technologies has also been accompanied by a notable shift in the purpose of innovations, transitioning from functionality, technology centricity, to focusing more on enhancing the user experience. And with that, commercial platforms, payment platforms were created, e-commerce as we know it erupted, giving rise to another corridor of global trade that bears little resemblance to the Silk Road or the early maritime trading networks. In addition, this transformation in particular has facilitated the expansion of manufacturing chains globally, the digital transformation, enabling resource and operating cost arbitrage, access to markets which are fundamental tenets of globalization. Then on to, sorry, I give you a moment to read this. And then on to the next very important topic, which is of the 4 mobilities, the one related to the transfer of goods. I want to introduce you to a seemingly more humble invention. Within the world of international trade, this rather unpolished shipping container stands out as an incredibly remarkable innovation, revolutionizing the speed, efficiency, and affordability of cross-border movement of goods. It allowed the movement of goods to shift from cumbersome bulk parcels, which move at slower speeds, if you see the picture on the left, to slower speeds and were prone to loss and damage, to a completely standardized and intermodal-friendly format where speeds and distances improved with far lesser loss and damage. The shift to containerization alone reduced transportation costs by more than 90%. And it did not stop there. Unit costs continued to reduce over time. In 1964, when this began, the cost to ship 1 container load would have cost about $10,000 US in 2020 dollars. With modern containerized shipping providing further economies of scale and other associated efficiencies, it would cost only a little more than the equivalent of $300 in the same year currency. The brilliance of shipping containers has become a cornerstone in the world economy. When you think that 80% of trade volume, international goods, relies on sea transport, predominantly in containers. Furthermore, the upsurge in containerized shipping demand, starting with the very first container shipping movement on Ideal X, which is the name of ship, ships have constantly been upsized to cope with the continuous development in the ports that serve them. So this innovation has played a pivotal role indeed in reshaping global logistics and significantly contributed to the creation of global value chains. With the ease of moving not just finished goods, but intermediate goods, the world could truly be a multi-layered, multi-location factory system. If you look at this slide, and just note the top line, you will find that intermediate goods have grown in its proportion of trade over time. An intermediate good is something that you will not be able to use. And 2/3 of the time when you open a container, today, it's an intermediate good. It's a movement from one factory to another in another country. Now, it is up then to countries within all this backdrop to establish its own play, its own role, its own claim to the share of the economic pie offered by global trade. To look at that, maybe it is best to again take a look at one of the models by which countries advance themselves. The Rostow's model argues that global trade, that industrialization occurs in 3 phases, namely the potential to grow, the early phases, realizing growth itself, and then a movement to a more mature market phase. In the first phase, countries experience lower wage levels, and production within a country is mainly to meet the local needs. And with increased investment and the development of infrastructure, countries move on to later stages of growth where wages begin to increase and production is then used for export markets. And that's the takeoff period. Eventually, countries will enter the global market for ideas, for further investment, leading to the latermost stage of industrialization, i.e. becoming a more mature market. And in that environment, I see developed countries fitting this description. Higher wages are experienced, higher value production becomes the area of focus with emphasis on innovation and consumption-driven growth. So again, I bring back this chart and show you that notwithstanding the same conditions prevailing upon all countries, different countries emerge with different outcomes. And among those vying for economic escape velocity is ourselves, Singapore, whose story is best told, whose story has been told by many observers, but probably best recorded in the book From Third World to First by Mr. Lee. Looking at trade and GDP per capita, we see this as akin to a chicken and egg situation. Both factors related to each other, continuously reinforce each other, and the correlation between the nation's level of trade engagement and its GDP per capita is actually fairly well proven. What does this mean then for Singapore? Well, if you look at the chart on the left, it says trade has always been a key driver of our economic growth since independence. It has consistently been 3 to 4 times our level of GDP, even as GDP grew. With such high levels of trade relevance and engagement, we can see how this is translated to GDP per capita, which saw an equally sustained upward trend since independence. Now, despite enjoying the tailwind of many trade and globalization drivers discussed earlier, Singapore today stands at the crossroads of global trade. Our physical location at the Straits of Malacca is one that Singapore is blessed with. But with further technological changes, shifts in globalization dynamics, climate concerns, geopolitical tensions, trade flows will continue to shift and perhaps with greater uncertainty. For instance, global geopolitical tensions are rewriting trade agreements and repositioning preferred supply and manufacturing centers of production. In the past, we saw offshoring, and then for resilience, nearshoring. And now when relationship between nations are taking precedence over proximity, we are encountering friendshoring. Friendshoring refers to the routing of supply chains to produce or to manufacture in friendly or allied countries and away from geopolitical rivals. It alters the traditional interregional dynamics, and as seen in the case of Singapore, which has traditionally thrived on being a hub for open trade, this could become somewhat of an issue. The shift is reflected and is evidenced in new trends and new observations like how Mexico has surpassed China as a trade partner with the United States. Add to that the concerns about carbon footprint. And you will see that today, if you are a manufacturer trying to design your future supply chain, it would certainly not be an easy one. Worst of all, the criteria for the future resilient, sustainable supply chains is still being debated and inconclusive. Now, my point is this, that Singapore has always kept up with the ebbs and flows of globalization and trade, developing infrastructure that preempts the future. For instance, in its visionary megaport and its comprehensive international maritime ecosystem. One example of the components of the modern-day trading ecosystem that it has recently focused on is digital trade. COVID-19 put global supply chains through a disruptive test, and many gaps were exposed. When we did our self-analysis, we realized that we had actually been caught somewhat napping in the area of developing the enablement for digital trade. Yes, although the desire for digital trade is jointly embraced, but our capability to enable it seamlessly with interoperability and with the right rules and governance and law was somewhat slow. The Singapore response then was to develop and launch a supply chain digital infrastructure through public-private partnership that would enable more supply chain operations to be digitally connected to take advantage of interoperable digital solutions or applications. This infrastructure is called SG TradeX. It recently hosted the SG TradeX Maritime Conference to update the industry on latest developments, and DPM Heng, the guest of honor, underscored that despite the volatile and uncertain economic climate, and despite us not knowing how future trade may be, Singapore should continue to evolve and be ready to turn a perilous situation into a positive one. At this point, it is perhaps appropriate to ask ourselves why the ability for Singapore to adapt is so important. Despite its post-independence challenges, like the scarcity of human resources and space, Singapore has exemplified the great escape from poverty through strategic engagement, industrial growth, and investment in global trade. If we look at the Human Development Index from the 1990s to today, over the last 3 decades, Singaporeans have, on average, become approximately 30 times richer and ranks 12th among 191 countries and territories, placing it in the very high human development category, according to the UN Human Development Reports. So by now, we have addressed how global trade has personally impacted us, starting with the supermarket, how globalization started with trade as a precursor, transport, technology, industrialization, understood some of these sort of ways to consider globalization as a phenomenon, and then see how Singapore has established itself and continues to adapt. For the remainder of the lecture, I will move to a general discussion of trade and globalization. I will move to from our general discussion on trade and globalization to a more specific one on the nature of supply chains. I'm looking at a clock that says I've got 16 more minutes, and I'll have to pick up the speed. But this should be simple. An apple versus an avocado, right? Now, I'd like to bring this simple example so that we can all connect to it. What do you think are the supply chain activities that are involved in getting these items into your hands as a consumer? Okay, we start with the avocado. The supply chains are actually quite straightforward. Supply chain activities are actually quite straightforward. It is planted, plucked, and packed, and then transported to where it will be sold through special refrigerated containers with quality control, perhaps a ripening room and distribution. Finally, it gets into your hands. It's quite linear. The product essentially stays about the same from inception to your hands. But what about an Apple iPhone? I give it to you all in one go, right? Very much more complicated and multifaceted. Many components produced in different countries, which are then shipped as intermediate goods before assembly. The components themselves may have their parts shipped in with earlier tier supply before they are even made into intermediate goods. After assembly of the final components, the final products then are shipped by Apple to the 175 countries or so that Apple has customers in. Now imagine the complexity of getting all these supply chain activities done in a synchronous manner. Yeah? And you will realize that it is indeed not a simple challenge. This is also an example where globalization has made it possible, with the technologies that accompany it, for manufacturing activities to be spread through the world through the creation of global value chains. Okay? In this flatter world that results, countries compete for their share of global value chains. The higher you are on the chain, the greater the prosperity you are likely to experience. And by becoming more integrated, a country adds more value to a finished product. With China joining the WTO in 2001, what this chart shows you is the situation at the end of the first decade, about 2009. What you see is that China's imports were predominantly intermediate goods still at the time, 75% intermediate after 1 decade, while its exports were mostly finished products, about 60%. So when you put these two together, what it says is China is the finisher, the finishing factory, importing a lot of intermediate goods, shipping out a lot of finished goods. And that is why one of the reasons why China became known then in the first decade as the world's factory. This profile reflected its cost and capability advantage over other comparable and competitive countries at the time. As economies mature, they become more prosperous. You remember Rostow's model, wages rise, they will no longer be classified as low cost. They need to move up the value chain, produce higher value goods from scratch, and not be just a finisher. So what you see on this chart are also the more developed economies with more balanced import-export ratios, like the US and the EU, for instance. As a point of interest, Singapore's own import-export ratio of intermediate goods was also quite balanced by 2009. So we have reached a certain level of value add and maturity as well. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the trade of intermediate goods rose as transport costs came down significantly in the course of time. This is one of the reasons why, during the period of accelerated globalization, every 1% of GDP growth required the support of 2 to 3% of container trade growth to bring that about. So accelerated globalization and GDP growth in the world in a few decades before was driven a lot by industrialization. And that meant high volume of trade exchanged. And because of the intermediate factor, the whole entire volume of trade was a multiplier of the GDP percentage growth that it enabled. Conversely, when globalization slows down, we would expect this multiplier to reduce. And we saw that over the last decade. Another reason for the decreasing role of trade volume to GDP is also the fact that more of global GDP is being generated by non-physical sectors, non-manufacturing related activities like services, hence reducing the dependency on manufacturing in general. But having said all that, over the last, say, 10 or 20 years, when you think of China entering WTO and becoming a factory and then going up the value chain, if you put all this together and you add up the flows of trade around the world, what you have will be this picture. In the year 2000, global container flow was 237 million TEUs. And China at the time was something like about 18% of total trade engagement. Fast forward about 20 years, you find that China has risen to almost 30% of global trade engagement, where global volume had grown to about 2.5 times the volume that you saw in the last chart. What I should also point out are the trade routes that expanded because of it. Clearly, there will be a very, a very sizable Asia-European trade route, very sizable trans-Pacific trade route. And what is remarkable is also a sizable intra-Asia trade. So when you think about, I'm concerned about the trade between China and US and China and Europe, they represent 2 of the 3 or 4 significant trade routes in the world. And anytime there is a tension, it tends to seem that when you have a China +1 strategy, intra-Asia trade increases because there is a dependency on other developing nations to fill the space that is being withdrawn from China. Now, it's within this whole moving picture that Singapore established its fortune over the last 2 or 3 decades now. Look at the container ports and how they have changed as a result of the scenario that I've painted for you. This was a picture of container ports in 1980, and then 1990, 2000, there's more and they get bigger, and then in 2010, and although we are a little red dot, if you think that Singapore it's not so clear which of those dots represent Singapore, well, surprise, it's actually the biggest one. The visionary had said Singapore's raison d'etre was its port. And we must continue to strive to remain a major hub port. For Singapore, our container port journey began at Tanjong Pagar Terminal. PSA, which was then a stat board, decided in 1966 to build the first container terminal after the invention of the container. And at that point in time, not a single shipping line had committed to building container ships for the Europe-Far East trade. So on the 2 charts that I showed earlier, trade routes was actually non-existent for containers. There were other trades, but we wanted to focus on the future of trade, using technology as the alternative. So in 1970, so this was a risky move. Now a sure bet, but anyway, risky at the time. In 1972, a dedicated container berth was opened at Tanjong Pagar, and more than 1,000 excited port workers and officials turned up on that day, June 23rd, to greet the MV Nihon, which arrived with 300 containers from Rotterdam. And with that, Singapore became the first Southeast Asian port that could accommodate the 3rd generation container vessel, making it an important link to the Western destinations. One good infrastructure decision does not keep a port relevant through the decades. In the 1970s, container trade started off slowly but surely. In the 1980s, the rapid expansion of global value chains and world trade saw Singapore move up its port rankings. 1982, we handled our first million. What took us 10 years to achieve in terms of volume, the second million was achieved in 4 years, and time kept getting shorter as you see Singapore climbing up the rankings. PSA then added a second terminal in the 80s, Brani Capital Terminal that was, Brani in the 90s, and by the late 90s to early 2000, we were building up Pasir Panjang. Last year, fast forward 40, 50 years, PSA handled 39 million TEUs of global trade, and Janada said, together with the rest of our portfolio, we actually handle 1 in 10 containers. Now, many factors have helped keep PSA Singapore near the top of the charts, top of its game. And chief among them will be for Singapore itself to always have that superior connectivity, strong shipping line commercial partnerships, forward-looking investment in technology and automation, and comprehensive digital initiatives to improve the ecosystem. I want to use a couple of minutes to introduce to you the nature of work that we do in Singapore, because the volume that we do is staggering relative to our population of 5 million people. For all intents and purposes, should only need a port that handles 2 million TEUs, but we handle close to 40. There are gateway ports and there are transshipment ports. A gateway port tends to be a bridge between sea transport and land transport. Its growth depends on the hinterland. In Singapore, our hinterland is small. Transshipment, however, is a service that is provided to shipping lines around the world to ensure that they have an optimum shipping network. The role and potential of a transshipment port far outstrips or is not related to the size of its hinterland at all. Okay. All right, so there's gateway and there's transshipment. I'm skipping through some of this because I think you're probably somewhat familiar already, the difference between gateway and transshipment. But in fact, I want to get to the types of transshipment, which is one level of granularity, which also emphasizes how Singapore tries to address the complexities of the trade and make that our differentiation. The most commonly known transshipment model is hub and spoke model. It revolves around central hubs strategically positioned as distribution centers, facilitating the efficient movement of goods to and from neighboring nations. The hub and spoke model used to be the dominant model, and Singapore served that for many, many years. But in the past 20 to 30 years, as container ships continue to increase in size, relay transshipment has risen in importance. Relay transshipment is designed to address the challenges posed by longer inter-regional distances. Instead of centralized regional hubs, this relay model relies on a series of global ports functioning as relay crossover points along major trade routes. Today, PSA operates the most transshipment locations in the world compared to any other global port group. Now think about it like taking the MRT in Singapore. If you went to Sengkang on the Purple Line and then took an LRT service to a specific Sengkang sublocation, that would be like hub and spoke in a small regional enclave. But if you then went from Sengkang to Tuas with a combination of the purple and green lines connecting through Outram, that would be relay movement through Outram. And you would think about Singapore as being that Outram when it comes to containers from different regions far-flung from each other. The operational complexities are just quite different. Aside from that capability, superior connectivity is incredibly important. In the case of Singapore, we are connected to 600 ports globally with daily servings to every major port in the world. Every day we handle about 100,000 TEUs. Recently about 110 because of the Red Sea crisis. There was a lull followed by a big rush. And if you were to line up these 100,000 TEUs end to end, you would form a line that would go back and forth across Singapore 20 times in a single day. So what is Singapore's value proposition? It's just that we are a very good operator. Is connectivity all that is important? Why do shipping lines keep calling us? There are some other intangible drivers that are key to Singapore's competitive advantage. And this was done based on a consultant's research to verify that the PSA formula is indeed what is right for Singapore. Scalability, reliability, ecosystem stability, the rule of law, governance, research and development, financials, services, ship technology, shipping law, digital services. The list is long. But through many of these companies forming a very complete ecosystem in Singapore, Singapore has attained and held on to the top international maritime center for many years now. And there are many, many other accolades. I have it in my speech, but I will skip through them. What is more important is that we had to keep constantly adapting over 3 generations of Singapore terminals. Throughout this exciting takeoff period, we saw the need to continually adapt as the demands of customers changed. First generation would be the city terminals, comprising Tanjong Pagar, Keppel Brani, still manually operated today, still serving us for at least another 2 or 3 years. They saw us through a period of extremely high growth. The second generation would be the Pasir Panjang terminals, the block in the middle, which were developed in 2 phases. They were, unlike the first set of city terminals, they were built with higher cost, not on land, but reclaimed from sea. As such, they could be designed with flexibility to cope with the demands of shipping industry, including the mega ships as container ships became known as they grew in size. The flexibility allowed us to design long linear berth, enabling higher efficiency transshipment. For many years, Pasir Panjang, with its own progressive automation, was also the sandbox for all the technologies that we would use in Tuas. And the next generation, the newest, is Tuas Terminal, the first phase of which was officially opened in 2022. When it's finally completed, it will be the world's largest automated transshipment facility or a port facility of any kind. What is unique about these three generations is that they're all operational at the same time, from the totally manual to the totally automated, unlike in some other countries. We do not wait for our terminals to be obsolete, neither do we close them prematurely. But what it also demonstrates is that we are always looking into the future, planning ahead and building on our strengths, working with our workforce from the first generation to the ones who are very reliant on technology. Well, these rapid changes in facilities and port technologies needs to be supported by our workforce willingness to embrace change with the ability to upskill and reskill. So the labor management relationship in the port environment is monumental. It's very, very important. Finally, Tuas. When we started planning Tuas Port with a design capacity of 65 million TEUs, that volume was double our business size at the time in 2016. But planning ahead 20, 30-year cycles, this seemed quite natural. Aside from showcasing the automation and digital technologies, Tuas is also built with climate-first considerations. Another unique feature of Tuas is that it's adjacent to the manufacturing hinterland managed by JTC. And at the interface between industry and Tuas is being built a highly technology-enabled logistic zone. So we're trying to use Tuas basically to reimagine the future of flow-through logistics. To close off this lecture, let's have a look into the future of Tuas with a very short video where the teams from MPA, PSA, and our partners and stakeholders have worked together to turn this vision into reality. I'll give you the video, but I just want to very quickly summarize that in the first two-thirds of this discussion, we went through how trade started and how it enabled globalization, but the drivers keep changing. And as you go through the next two lectures, you'll find that we'll start exploring more and more of the future drivers. I haven't even talked about AI yet. You'll be wondering, when is AI going to show up? Well, it will show up. It's not just all geopolitics, okay? Things are fundamentally changing the world that we live in, and it's people making sense of it, creating new rules and requirements that we respond to that ultimately requires us to adapt and make sure that we are kept at the top of our game, and I believe this video will give you one of the examples of how it's done.
Today we are not only signifying the development of Tuas Port, but marking its place in Singapore's maritime history.
The move to Tuas goes beyond just having a bigger terminal. Tuas Port is also an opportunity to peer over the horizon and rethink the future of shipping. Very happy to see that just 3 years after Progress is on track despite all of the troubles which COVID caused us, and we completed phase 1 last December, and ships are calling and the port is in operation. Well done, PSA.
At the countdown, and in 3, 2, 1, TWAS, from vision to reality.
We've reached today's milestone because of your collective efforts. This opening of Tuas Port marks the beginning of a new chapter, and I'm confident that this bold move will help PSA sustain its tradition of success and secure our maritime future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tan. For those watching the lecture on Facebook, please submit your comments and questions through the Facebook comment box. For our audience members here, please step up to the mic to ask your questions. May I now invite Mr. Patrick Lee, Cluster CEO, Singapore and ASEAN Markets of Standard Chartered Bank, to start the Q&A session.
Hi, Pat.
Hey, Chong Meng, thank you so much. Well, it's a great honor to be here. And first of all, I think we should all thank Chong Meng for the great and masterful exposition of the history of trade and Singapore's involvement. He covered so much ground, plus his own contribution at PSA in terms of building Tuas Port and taking this to the next level. So thank you, Chong Meng, for the great insights. When Chong Meng asked me to come and help moderate here, I said definitely yes, because global trade, Singapore's role in it is something that is very much close to Standard Chartered Bank's heart. We are, in our DNA, we are a trade bank, and we were the first bank in Singapore. We've been here 165 years. And guess what we did when we first started here? We were facilitating trade. You go back to 1887, we helped finance one of the first companies in Singapore, set up operations and set up credit facilities for trade, and that was Straits Trading Company, which began its life with helping tin extraction out of Malaya, again, the connection with Singapore, and then exporting it to the rest of the world. And guess where they had their first smelter? Pulau Brani. So then that's the origin of trade. So great to see our involvement and also our history, and we all play a role in this. And clearly, Singapore is a global trade financial hub. They're so closely linked. It's a super connector, very much like the port is. And so it's very timely and very interesting to have this discussion. Before I open up to the floor for questions, maybe I'll start with 2 questions for Chong Meng, if I may. The first one would be elaborating on what you talked about, globalization 4.0. And in your lecture, you did talk about how you're going to peering into the future. So I'm going to preempt that a little bit. But as the economy transforms from manufacturing to services, and we go to the next level, how do you see globalization 4.0 impacting Singapore's role as a global trade hub?
Well, I think you'll create opportunities for us. Equally, you also have some threats if we're not ready. First and foremost, digital trade will become more and more comprehensive and doable. Trade will no longer just be the movement of goods, but the whole complement of all the things that need to accompany the trade activity itself. And so there will be more opportunities for people like StanChart who want to offer finance with higher security, for instance. Now, I see this going forward as being very highly technology enabled. When we consider the IR 4.0 experience, essentially it was how digital and people and processes were coming together. And we were remixing the way in which business deliver the services. I think this will happen in the trade industry as well. And if Singapore were to catch on to a few of those things that are still at the nascent stage in this world, we would be also a forerunner, not just in building more and more advanced megaports, but better and better trade systems. Patrick and I both sit on the board of SG TradeX. So the mission there is indeed to create enabling infrastructure. And simple as it may sound, I mean, it's just a data infrastructure that enables people to be connected through a neutral and trusted means with the right data definition, right data package, and the right usage to be constantly monitored. And of course, at the end of the day, it's consent-driven. You can't use somebody's data in the commercial world unless the other person is agreeable. Now, surely then this doesn't sound too complicated when we have so many things that we can do on our mobile phones and so on. But the truth of the matter is SG-TradeX is still one of one in the world of such nature, public-private partnership, that is just starting to show how all these requirements of good governance, neutrality, government-backed, and efficient data management can actually be accomplished. So I think lots to come.
Absolutely right, and we're very excited because the next step is really digital connectivity, right? And what does that translate into? Not just trade of goods, human capital, services. My second question is more around the question of how does Singapore stay competitive and relevant in this space? PSA, for example, connected to over 600 ports globally, among the busiest in the world. And clearly it's really helped Singapore with that escape velocity. But what are the challenges that could come? We've seen around the world in history has also taught us similar city-states that have thrived as global trade hubs, like Venice, for example, is a city-state. They lost their way through geopolitical changes, through changes in technology, through changes in maritime superpowers, and the way trade flowed. What are the things that Singapore should worry about? We hear also about the Isthmus of Kra, that the potential link being built across the southern Thailand-Malay border. So what are the things that would you think we should worry about in terms of Singapore remaining competitive?
I think we should stay very plugged into the way countries grow around us. Southeast Asia, east and west of us, China, Europe, and the United States. Now think about the fact that because we are situated in the Straits of Malacca, we are at the crossroads between China as a factory in the west, in the east, sorry, and Europe as a consumer in the west. Let's say if the factory shifted to India, it won't be because of geopolitical tensions that suddenly we are less relevant. It won't be because of technology or Isthmus of Kra modifications. It will just simply be that the world continues to shift its center of gravity and things continue to change. I'm sensing that our mic is cutting in and out. Is that correct? Yeah?
Okay, let's try this one. Is that better? Okay. So I think first and foremost, trade is about being a part of a global economy, staying relevant in trade and being able to have a value proposition that is first to the shipping lines and then to the countries that they serve, being their partner. And to some extent, that is also the reason why PSA decided about 5, 6, 7 years ago now to venture beyond ports into total supply chain. Because if you're only serving the shipping lines, you're one step removed from serving the end customer whose goods you actually move. So by moving that way, I think we are more involved in the movement of the cargo itself. So I think Singapore needs to play the game at multiple levels. Stay close to the countries, make sure that we are aware of how the technological innovations and things like that can either help us or even disrupt our business model. Be concerned that there are competitors always who are just outside the door, waiting to take on some of the business that we might be careless enough to leave behind. In the Straits of Malacca today, Singapore has about 2/3 market share of the transshipment, and Klang has announced their expansion, and other places will also announce their expansions. In the global interest of what it takes to make the global maritime efficient, actually, the world doesn't just need TWAS. The world needs good infrastructure in quite a number of places for the whole thing to work efficiently. So it's not like we are the only ones who want to invest and others should not do so. But being aware of what the competitors are doing and ensuring that we stay a step ahead. Coming to the point about the Isthmus of Kra, I would say indeed if the plan was to build a canal across, you could see ships bypassing the Straits of Malacca. one of the things that people are not aware of is that many of the ships that pass the Straits of Malacca don't actually call Singapore. If it's a commodity ship that loads in, say, an oil and gas product in the Middle East and is due for delivery into Japan or Korea, there's no reason for it to stop. So to some extent, having a shorter transit is good for the industry, certainly good for the climate, and not necessarily a bad thing because we actually have quite congested waters. But if it is about container-based trade or some of the other trades that do make their call in Singapore, we should ensure that our service to these customers make them want to move down to Singapore and call in Singapore instead of paying the extra duties to cross the canal, because I can bet you it will not be free. If it is a land bridge, however, then there are mixed views as to whether it will truly be better than just simply staying in the maritime mode of transport, because you have to move from ship to rail and back to ship again, or even worse, ship to truck to ship. And all the handling costs and charges, well, better come to Singapore.
Thank you, Chong Meng. Stay relevant to your customers. That's the key paradigm. I'd like to open it up now to questions from the floor. We don't have any questions yet online, so if I could take some questions, please put your hand up. But I think that we have a mic that will go around, or there are mics on the various levels there. So please come forward and please, we invite you now to put your questions to Chong Meng.
Hi, two short questions. With the rise of inshoring, friendshoring, and nearshoring, how would it impact the transshipment activities of PSA ports? And second question is, with the trend towards a diversification, splintering of supply chains, how would it impact on PSA's port?
Sorry, can you repeat this?
With the splintering of supply chains, global supply chains,
Splintering.
Splintered. So how would that your a regional hub model actually work, given if that's the increasing trend? Thank you.
Okay. Well, the first one, as you say, is friendshoring, nearshoring, and so on. It's a change of the production system. Now, some of these changes to the production system, if it is intended to be, say, future-proof, to be more resilient and to be more climate-friendly, it is something that we would really encourage. We stay alongside our partners and we advise and we work with them to ensure that they are also able to make the best decisions. Volumetrically speaking, I would say that it really depends on the changes that they are contemplating. Supply chain shrinkage, the reduction in the multiplier, all that will mean slower growth ahead. It doesn't mean no growth. So if GDP grows at, say, 3%, and the current multiplier is at 1, which means container growth will also go at 3%, it doesn't mean zero. It's a very big base, but it's certainly not the 5 and 6. But a 5 and 6% growth is something we can't sustain anyway. It burns up our planet, right? So it is not a bad thing. And I think there is a business strategy and a business model for different trajectories, different scenarios. It doesn't mean that it is any worse than the 5 to 6% scenario. It does mean that you have to be very conscious of the supply-demand balance. And if you tip over the supply into overcapacity, then you may find that the industry may go through troublesome times. This industry is a very capital-intensive industry, so it has to be indeed rather carefully managed. I'm just describing so far the port's response. On the other hand, PSA now has a supply chain business whose mission it is to help industrial players and customers to resolve problems such as this. And the more there are problem statements, the more opportunities for our supply chain cargo solutions part of the company to really thrive and grow and make a mark for itself. So I'd say, yes, on the port side, we've got to work with a lower growth environment, but on the cargo solution side, which I believe is even more important in the future to see things end to end, it will be a brighter future. The other one on supply chain splintering, I think are you referring to the concern about the bifurcation of markets, and as a result you may need to create one supply chain for this politically friendly group and another supply chain suitable for this, and information should not pass and so on and so forth. That worries us quite a bit.
the trends and outcomes. I mean, the concerns are there. Whether these concerns will be baked into clear substantive trends that say you must do this, you must not do this, we are still not sure. And how that will impact businesses, whether we can set up entities in different locations that can serve global markets, or we have to serve locations very carefully. All these are things that we should anticipate, perhaps preempt if possible, but the time is, I think, still a bit early from making final decisions. So we are concerned, but we're watching.
Mr. Tan, in response to those challenges, you talked about how you are therefore moving into supply chain consultancy, that business. Surely part of that is also the fact that you do have ports around the world. So could you just, add to that response how the international business is part of that resilience strategy, or that strategy, and how then it would benefit Singapore as well. The second question is about flow-through logistics. I think you mentioned it just now as another thrust into the future. What does that mean? Does it really mean that containers are brought into the port and there, using AI, they exchange what they need to exchange without bringing anything closer into the country? I don't know. So what does flow-through logistics mean?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All
So
right.
two questions: your international business, how does that help with the resilience and then benefit Singapore? Then the second one, what flow-through logistics is.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just trying to, we are on live audience and we are also on, online media as well. Well, during COVID, do you recall that we were concerned about whether we'll get our food and our essentials? Because to some extent, our market demand is fairly limited, so whether it's eggs or rice or whatever, and we were buying from particular qualified sources. But the qualified sources may or may not have adequacy during such times, and the logistics may or may not be robust. The other thing is we did not have the digital systems that would track our entire inventory in Singapore, real time, on water, and the deliveries that are to be made. So in short, even though we are very advanced and we have all the commercial agreements, when there is a crisis, we are not sure whether commercial agreements will hold up, and physically we don't know where things stand. You think about trying to address each of these. If you only have a port in Singapore but do not have a network with feet on the ground, boots on the ground, eyes on the cargo, you're actually still reliant on a third party. We offered during the time of COVID, all right, here we go, was to basically support the government in all of these aspects. And that same support is being stretched now into other critical supplies that are important for this nation during different types of crisis scenarios, be it COVID, a repeat thereof, or other types of crisis. That is dependent on the fact that PSA has an international network, and on top of that also has a network that doesn't stop just at the port, but through rail service, through inland container depot, a further visibility into the hinterland. Where they overlap with our supplies of choice, that would be an advantage. So think about this little red dot having tentacles. We develop it not for Singapore, we develop it for a business that supports the shipping industry. Shipping industry doesn't just call at one port, they call at multiple ports. They want to have multiple visibility. So our first and foremost objective was commercial, to develop a network of ports, not just a single one. But in time of need, it became clear that this network was also something of a strategic advantage. When we talk about flow-through, I would say that the logistics industry, everybody knows is a team sport. Yeah, we are maybe somewhat pampered because we buy something online, Shopee or whatever, and it gets delivered to the door. We think that the person who is involved in the delivery is just the person who shows up at the door. Well, there's a lot of things that have to take place, including the banks, including the customs, including so on and so forth. So there's compliance, there's financial flow. We are all treated to today's modern, simple solutions. Credit card, confirmation of your requirement, and then there it shows up, right? But in bulk trade, in cross-border trade, all these things are anything but simple. When you get to intermodal junctions between the ship and the rail, the documents that are needed to verify your cargo at the shipping link is different from the documents for the rail link, and so on and so forth. And so to think of flow-through, it doesn't just simply happen. It will happen physically eventually, but it will not happen seamlessly. And so one of the things that we considered earlier on was how much do we need to know of the whole multi-segment logistics in order to really make a difference. With IRR 4.0, it became more than just, I want to own more intermodal parts. It became one of an opportunity where digital will enable us to build a bridge between the different segments. So it's the world now is different. In the past, yes, it's a team sport, but everybody is a separate player. And owning more of the separate players does not create flow through. But today with digital, it's possible. Since it's possible, you change the strategy. It's now good to own all the interacting parts, isn't it? Well, that's the theory. And when I say we, I should remind myself that I stepped off PSA last week.
We have a couple of questions online, so why don't we go to those? There's a question from Robin Tomlin on the Belt and Road Initiative. Can you comment on the potential impact on PSA of Belt and Road investments in ports in the Indian Ocean?
I think the Belt and Road Initiative was actually a very positive and a very important one, because ports, by very nature of the high capital investment requirement, as well as the conditions to make an efficient port are not immediately straightforward. They tend to be built, I would say, somewhat lagging the time that they are needed. In many places, townships, countries, industries suffer for the lack of good port infrastructure. So whether it is driven by a commercial concern like ourselves, or by a government agenda or government initiative rather, like the Belt and Road, I think ports do create a vibrancy of trade, and the Belt and Road Initiative has indeed that contribution. If you think about transshipment relies on the fact that there are cargo coming from other places looking for destinations that need a place to switch. So the more trade there is, the more transshipment potential there would be. So I would say it's pro-trade, as long as it's pro-trade, open trade, and gives rise to meaningful growth, it is actually a good development. The thing that then we ask ourselves is, does it take up too much of the competitive space that we should thrive in? And up until now, it has actually been quite complementary. Singapore's investments are also along the Belt and Road. It's just we have not declared that those terminals or those ports are along the Belt. And to me, the Belt and Road simply emphasizes the main routes of trade that support the economies that thrive along this route. If you add up all the economies along Belt and Road, it's actually the lion's share of global economy, right? And so Singapore itself has a strategy of developing ports that are somewhat associated with main trade routes. The fundamental purpose, call it whatever you want, is very similar and the same. Yeah? So it's just the competitive element, and we have to make sure that we have a good relationship with the people who are driving the initiative, and often we see them as people in industry as well, rather than just coming with a national agenda and bad for the industry.
Another question on China, and more specifically
Singapore's competitive position versus Shanghai, you saw the chart that Shanghai is raced ahead, obviously because it's such a big market. China has such a big hinterland. But now that Shanghai is persistently ahead of Singapore in the stakes, what are the things that Singapore ought to learn, step up to edge closer to Shanghai's port status?
So Shanghai as a port plays quite a different role from Singapore. It is at the mouth of the Yangtze River, and it is the place where they consolidate cargo from the upper reaches of the Yangtze, that is their catchment, into Shanghai port for an exchange, exports or imports. Those are conditions that Singapore will not have in its immediate land-based hinterland. Singapore should consider itself as being such a player within a regional market, so the hub and spoke model, but not necessarily focusing on just it must be a Singapore cargo. So the role that Singapore would play, that Shanghai plays vis-a-vis their hinterland, is essentially the same, but we would look to support the growth of our neighbors, be it Indonesia, Philippines, Bangladesh, and so on, as part of that hinterland. There will also be ports within those countries that are going to be developed to meet the needs of the countries themselves. And again, because those ports play a different role, like Jakarta, Tanjung Priok, PSA is involved in Tanjung Priok as well. So it doesn't mean that we are competing between Tanjung Priok and Singapore. Well, they play different purposes. Every time Tanjung Priok matures and create a modern port, there's another budding port that comes up that requires transshipment. And so in this ebb and flow of what is a transshipment port and a gateway port, I would say we are quite blessed that we have so many of such opportunities. And so even though we don't have a China, we have quite a vibrant hinterland if we play a connecting role wisely and also efficiently. Secondly, Singapore has the opportunity to not just focus on the physical trading aspect, but also all the other support services of an international maritime center. Yes, in volume terms, Shanghai is ahead, but in terms of all the other qualifications that makes for an international maritime center, which in total adds up to that 7% of GDP, well, Singapore is still very much ahead. As I said, shipping law, R&D, finance, supply chain services, forwarding, all of this, and also the headquarters of customer companies, forwarding companies, they are based here. That ecosystem is still not, I would say, established to the same level of maturity in Shanghai.
No, you're absolutely right. It's the broader ecosystem, plus Singapore's role connecting China to the world as well.
Yeah, so don't think volume only, but think value. And there's value add.
Coming back to the auditorium, we have another question from the floor.
Actually, Mr. Lee, I have two.
Okay.
In the interest of time, I ask the first question first, and then maybe if there's still more time, ask the other. The first one is coming to a point that Mr. Tan, you said just now, that logistics is a team sport. And I wonder if we can think about the possibly competitive other ports in the region. I think you mentioned Klang as one potential competitor. In the past, we've had Gelang Patah as another potential competitor at our doorstep. Might we think about engaging these potential competitors as part of a team and using them as offloading kind of partners that we can collaborate with them? Is that possibility that Singapore leads, or PSA leads, that kind of team game, cooperation instead of competition?
Most of the time we compete. Some of the time there are opportunities to collaborate, yes. But if you think of the Straits of Malacca, certainly you talk about Gelang Patah, I think you're referring to Tanjung Pelapas. They are very much a transshipment port like ours. They serve their customers on a ship-to-ship basis very much like we do. The opportunities for collaboration are lesser. Klang, I would say, plays 60% transshipment, 40% local cargo, so they have a rich hinterland. And there are, say, end cargo owners who may want to have a choice, whether, especially their manufacturing facility is in Malaysia, they may want to have a choice depending on FTA, depending on whatever, to say, well, we might want to export through Klang or we might want to export through Singapore, and whether we'll be able to support them to create such optionality. The answer would be yes, but done through our our cargo solutions unit. So our forwarding business is port agnostic. We can forward through different ports depending on what customer wants. But when it comes to comparing and competing on the basic knitting, which is running a port, I would say most of the time we do compete because the shipping lines have choice, and we want to make sure that the shipping line knows we always want to be the best for them.
Yeah. Thank you.
So outside the port, yes, there are common areas which I think we should see whether we can do a better job as an industry.
Indeed. Thank you. The second question, again, comes back to some of the things that you talked about in your speech, in your lecture. And it's the 4 spices in the recipe, or the 4 ingredients, or the various ingredients in the recipe. What do you think are the new ingredients that would guarantee or anchor Singapore's new dish that it needs to be relevant and be successful going forward?
Well, I think it will still be in the area of information, and perhaps from information, people think digitalization, people think efficiency. Today, I think we better think of knowledge. So digital is not just going to give us connectivity for us to know how to connect with each other better, interact more timely, seamlessly, and so on. That's all assumed to be done. In a few years' time, those that are not well connected and not seamless and all that, you find that it'll be out of place. So we have to assume that that basic digitalization benefit 101, we will all achieve it. Data flow will increase. Information does not become data or knowledge just by itself. You have to construct the data in a way that is discernible, decipherable, and at some point, we must aspire that that information becomes knowledge. The future world, I think, will compete on who has a better knowledge on how to really address solutions at its core, rather than fight at the periphery. So I hope in Singapore we can actually continue to do a better job on that one. Yeah, and then AI will play a role, supercomputing will play a role, and when quantum arrives, if it comes at our doorstep, it will also be very helpful as far as that is concerned. People, mobility, goods, and all that are all physically related. And I would say the technology pathways for those, automation, VR, AR, it's kind of mapped out, yeah. But it's in the data to knowledge and knowledge to change space that I think has the most unknown potential. Thank you very much.
Unfortunately, I think we're out of time. I've been asked to wrap up, but I think it shows the rich questions. We've got many more questions online, more questions from the floor. I think this is obviously a good advertisement to come back for the next lecture as you look forward. But clearly, lots of interest, a very fruitful set of Q&A, no doubt provoked by your great lecture. So thank you, Chong Meng.
Thank you all. And the second lecture will be shipping, maritime, IMC, and address some of those future technology and future service issues. And then the third one will deal with even more climate change related and such trends that would probably need a deeper response and a more ecosystem-based response. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Tan and Mr. Lee. We've come to the end of today's lecture. We would like to hear your views on the event. Please click our link on the Facebook feed or scan the QR code on the screen to submit your feedback. Mr. Tan Chong Meng's second lecture, titled Mega Maritime Movements, Adjustment in Orbit, will take place on 12 April. Details will be on our website and IPS Facebook page. We hope to see you then. Thank you all for attending today's lecture. Have a good evening ahead.